Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be sort of with you virtually. I so wish that I were on campus, which I've been able to do a couple of times in years past, but hopefully I'll be able to return next year. But in the meantime, it's really, really great to see all of you. I'm looking forward to what I hope will be a great discussion. I'm going to sort of introduce myself. I'm going to take us through some of the basics of what I see as the kind of main things to know when you're thinking about a career in this field. And then I'm really hoping that we can move into some questions and answers. And I know that Nicole and Marissa are going to help me with that as we move forward. So just by way of background, my name is Sarah Bidgood, and I direct the Eurasia Non-Proliferation Program at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, which is a research organization based in Monterey, California. So I'm speaking to you from Monterey. But perhaps more importantly, for the purposes of this conversation, I'm also a Wellesley alumna. So I finished my MA in Russian language and literature in 2009. And after that, I went on to do a master's degree at the University of North Carolina, where I focused on sort of the more Russian area studies issues. And then I did a master's degree after sort of taking some winding paths to get to where I am now in non-proliferation and terrorism studies at Middlebury's Institute of International Studies, which is based in Monterey. And so the place where I now work is a research organization or a think tank that is affiliated with the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. So part of what I enjoy about my work and what we'll kind of get into is the fact that I'm sitting at this nexus of kind of the academic world and the policy-oriented world. And I think part of what I'm hoping to impart to you today is that, you know, the fantastic liberal arts education that you're getting at Wellesley is the kind of thing that really prepares you to operate in all of those different worlds. And so we'll talk a little bit about what some careers are that kind of look like that. And I hope you will bring your questions about, you know, your specific areas of expertise and how they might apply to this field. And I'll do my very best to answer those. So I'm going to talk for just a few minutes at the beginning, and then we can move right into question and answer or into a discussion. But the first thing that I really want to make sure to do is kind of get us all on the same page here, because I know that when I was first entering this field, I really struggled to kind of understand how it was that my area of expertise and my area of research interest could have an influence on the non-proliferation space and in this very narrow kind of subset of the international security environment. And part of the reason why I'm able to do that is because we still have a lot of nuclear weapons in the world. And so what this chart is showing you here is sort of the global estimated number of nuclear weapons that span across the nuclear arsenals of the 9 countries that possess them right now. And I want to kind of tease out a couple of things in this chart because I think it's going to help us orient our conversation. So the first of these is that you can see that some of you who don't kind of focus on these issues in particular in your studies might be surprised to know that there are so many countries that have nuclear weapons. So there are 9 of them. You can see them written out on the chart here. And by far, the countries with the most number of nuclear weapons are Russia and the United States. And so between the two of them, they have just under kind of 13,000 nuclear weapons in their arsenal, which is really an astounding number when you think about kind of the impact of the potential detonation of just one of these nuclear weapons on sort of societies around the world. But something else that I think is really sort of arresting about these numbers is the fact that they represent a huge decrease from what they were at the height of the Cold War. So if we were looking at the same chart in 1985, we probably would have seen 85% more nuclear weapons than we see today. And that is always something that I find really shocking, because as a person who has mostly been doing this work, obviously in the post-Cold War period, but especially sort of in the last, 5 to 10 years, it blows my mind that this represents such a significant reduction from some of the challenges that we've seen in the past. So one of the other things that I want to kind of be sure to highlight here as we're looking at this chart is the discrepancy between the numbers of nuclear weapons that the United States and Russia have together, which represent about 93% of kind of this global arsenal that we're looking at, and the countries that are sort of next in line: France, China, the United Kingdom. So one of the things that you may hear when you're listening to the news or listening to, for instance, the presidential debates, is the fact that the United States in particular right now is very interested in bringing countries like China into the arms control environment. So they want China to be engaged with the United States and Russia in negotiating treaties that will reduce the numbers of nuclear weapons. But as you can imagine, if you're looking at this chart, there are really significant challenges that poses because the United States and Russia have so many more nuclear weapons than we estimate China to have in its arsenals. And so there's a lot of interesting work that people are doing in my field when they start to think about what are some mechanisms for sort of reducing the numbers of nuclear weapons that these countries have when you have such disparate numbers of nuclear weapons in the arsenals. So we can kind of talk through, if that's of interest to you, some of the creative approaches that people are looking at, but we're sort of going in our conversations about how to do this beyond thinking just about how many, quantitatively, how many numbers of nuclear weapons do various countries have, to what do their capabilities look like, and can we think creatively about ways to reduce capabilities across different domains and across different categories of weapons, rather than just thinking about these overall numbers. So that's some food for thought, and you can kind of ruminate on that and think if that brings up any questions for you when we move into our discussion. The other thing that I think is exciting and sort of interesting about the field of non-proliferation and about thinking about ways to mitigate nuclear crises is the fact that these are evolving challenges. So as I was just kind of describing to you, there are these changing numbers of nuclear weapons. So the chart that we were just looking at showed a big, huge reduction in the number of nuclear weapons from their Cold War height, which represents one kind of evolution, that evolving challenge that we face in our field. But another is the collapse of the sort of traditional mechanisms for arms control that we would have used in the past to limit the number of nuclear weapons that a country can have. And so traditionally, the United States and Russia have kind of negotiated these treaties on a bilateral basis. So they negotiate a treaty with one another and they decide, we're going to cap our numbers of this certain type of nuclear weapon at X, Y, or Z, and then we'll negotiate a regime to verify that. So we can have our inspectors go in and look and make sure that those weapons have actually been dismantled, and then feel secure that that has actually happened. Well, those kinds of treaties are starting to collapse. And so, for instance, in the summer of 2019, we saw the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty end. And that was a treaty that had limited the numbers of missiles of a certain range that the United States and Russia and other Soviet states were allowed to possess. That treaty is no longer in effect. And so what does that mean? That means that people like me who are thinking about making policy recommendations have to try to come up with new mechanisms to govern those types of weapons and try to feed those into the policymaking process. So those are the kinds of evolving challenges that my colleagues and I spend a lot of time thinking about. And they're the kinds of things where we need a lot of really creative ideas that are drawn from different disciplines. So even if you feel like your kind of domain is not necessarily firmly in the political science space or in the international relations space, we need all of these creative suggestions for ways to mitigate these kinds of challenges. I'm just looking at kind of my list here. You can see a number of the ones that particularly interest me as someone who's interested in Russia. And one of these is the crisis in US-Russia relations. So obviously this is really hard to kind of separate out from the collapse of that bilateral arms control mechanism that I was just describing, but I see this as almost it's really hard to identify where the causal arrow is here. So, are we seeing arms control collapse because the US-Russia relationship is so bad? Or is the US-Russia relationship becoming worse because we don't have these stabilizing mechanisms like arms control agreements to give that relationship some predictability? And so one of the things, I don't think anyone has the answer to that question, but it's something that's really interesting to contemplate. And for those of you who are kind of interested in area studies and interested in bringing in your language expertise and your cultural kind of fluency to discussions around arms control and non-proliferation and preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, that's the kind of expertise that is really helpful in kind of parsing out how all of these things work together. Another one I wanted to sort of be sure to highlight, because I think it's not always evident how this kind of lines up with the nuclear space, is the development of new disruptive types of technology. So for those of you who are kind of interested in computer science, for instance, or you're thinking about ways to govern, you're interested in robotics or informatics or any of that type of work, there are very positive applications of those kinds of technologies that can help sort of have civil applications and help improve the lives of lots of different people around the world. But then there are also potential military applications of those weapons as well. So one of the things we spend a lot of time thinking about in my field is automation and what that means for what we call nuclear command and control. So the means by which a nuclear weapon would be launched in not just in the United States, but in any one of those 9 countries that we looked at. And so there's a big conversation in our field about, is automation helpful because it removes kind of human beings from the decision-making process? Or when we look back at instances when nuclear weapons were almost used by accident, was it human beings being part of that decision-making structure that actually prevented that from happening? And how do we kind of govern and reconcile those things without excluding the positive benefits that these technologies can have, while still making sure that they don't have unintended impacts on the spaces that we look at? So those are just a couple of examples of the kinds of challenges that I enjoy looking at every day and find very thought-provoking and very scary, but also very sort of stimulating from an intellectual standpoint. And I bet you can think of other ones. So I'd be kind of curious to hear what in your own areas you think might be relevant for the kinds of issues that we're talking about. So I'm planting that seed, and I hope you'll ruminate on that a little bit over the next couple of minutes. The good news, though, despite all of these challenges, is that we do actually have a lot of tools in our toolkit to kind of keep weapons of mass destruction in check, to prevent them from spreading to other countries, and to limit the numbers and types of weapons of mass destruction that various countries have. So obviously, we've already talked about kind of treaties and international diplomacy, but I'm guessing that many of you either did Model UN in high school, or maybe you do it at Wellesley. That's a huge, international organizations and international multilateral diplomacy really can help shore up the non-proliferation regime. So this regime of all of these treaties and instruments, even when the bilateral relationships between countries like the United States and Russia are collapsing. So even though we're now at a moment where we're starting to see some of those US-Russia treaties fall apart, there are still these bigger multilateral treaties that are kind of keeping things together. And so that's something that I find heartening and really interesting to look at, the ways that multilateralism and bilateralism kind of work together in this particular space. And it's something that I've been able to see firsthand in my own experience, because I did some great internships where I was actually at the United Nations and seeing how all of these treaties worked to make our world a safer place. So again, happy to kind of talk about some of those with you, and I'd be curious to hear if any of you have experiences with some of these treaties. Another thing that we do a lot of in my work, because I don't work for the government, I work for a non-governmental organization, is facilitating dialogues, even at times when that kind of dialogue is not happening on an official level. So non-governmental organizations and academic institutions like mine can bring together, for instance, Russian and American experts, or Russian and American former policymakers who aren't necessarily still working for their governments, to try to sustain dialogue at times when this isn't happening on an official level. And that can be a really useful approach for making sure that these personal relationships between individuals continue even at very difficult moments in the kind of overarching high political relationship. And a lot of my research focuses on the ways that, for instance, in the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were able to sustain relationships in this very sensitive area, despite these challenges in their relationships. And part of what we've seen is that those personal relationships played a really important role. So there are lots of things that people who are not in government can do to facilitate that kind of dialogue. There are kind of citizen to citizen programs. Some of you who've done study abroad, I'm sure, can speak to the importance of having those personal relationships. That matters in an official context as well. So that's some of the type of work that I find very interesting, and that makes me feel really enthusiastic about the potential for US-Russia relations in this space to improve. We also, for those of you who are kind of majoring in the hard sciences, or you're physicists or you're chemists, there is a lot of technical work that goes into making all of these things function in the way that they're supposed to as well. So if you have an international treaty, for example, or you have an agency like the International Atomic Energy Agency, which you sometimes might have seen referred to in the news as sort of the UN's nuclear watchdog. It's the organization that is responsible, for instance, for making sure that in the context of the Iran deal, that Iran was actually abiding by the terms of that agreement. That is those are technical procedures. So there are these things called safeguards that are put in place to make sure that countries are not diverting nuclear material that is supposed to be for their nuclear power plants or their power grids to military purposes, like making a bomb. And we need people who are physicists and technical experts to be able not just to kind of do that work, but also to inform policymakers about what is going to be a sufficient level of verification or safeguarding to support some of these agreements that they negotiate on a diplomatic level. So I'm just trying to kind of bring in all of the various disciplines that are relevant here, because I think that's one of the things I find so exciting about this work, is that it's sitting at this intersection of policy and science and diplomacy in a way that I think few other things are. So that's one of the things I really love about it. For those of you who are kind of interested in, I know Wellesley has such a tremendous economics program, and I'm thinking about those of you who might be interested in finance and thinking about careers in that area. One of the other really important mechanisms that we have for preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction are export controls. And export controls mean making sure that if you are exporting nuclear equipment, like say you're, the United States, you're Westinghouse, you're a nuclear energy company, and you're selling a reactor to a country overseas, you want to make sure that those people who are purchasing that reactor technology aren't going to use that for the manufacture of nuclear weapons, for instance. And so there are safeguards in place to make sure that that doesn't happen. And one of the important components of that safeguarding is also making sure that money isn't being diverted to weapons of mass destruction programs. And so at every bank around the world, you will have a department that is focused on making sure that money isn't being, moved around in kind of the back end of the finance system to fund programs that are developing weapons of mass destruction. So any of you who are kind of thinking about pursuing a career in finance, that can be a very interesting and I think kind of, under advertised area where you can kind of work that does butt up against a lot of the issues that we're talking about here. So if you have any questions about that, I'd be happy to answer that too. But I wanted to kind of be sure to flag that for this audience, because I know many of you are probably, econ majors and kind of thinking about what's going to be next for you. So this is one possible area you could think about. We also have a lot of tools that we as non-governmental organizations can use to contribute to this process. So a lot of the work that I was just talking about, a lot of that does get done on a government to government level, particularly when it comes to kind of the negotiation of treaties, although I think NGOs are playing an increasingly important role in that process as well. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about that if that's of interest. But part of, I think, what is really exciting about doing this work right now is our access to new tools, new analytical approaches to contribute to sort of the verification of treaties, to transparency, and to these things that are really important for preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction. So a lot of the work that my colleagues do at CNS relates to analyzing, geospatial imagery. And for those of you who are sort of focused on GIS, for instance, or your geographers or geology majors, this is a really interesting tool to use to be able to determine from Monterey, California, for instance, what is happening in North Korea. And so I have colleagues who are able to look at commercially available satellite imagery, which is now widely available to regular consumers like us, and to say, it looks like North Korea is preparing to test a missile, we can look at their satellite imagery from that test site from one day to the next and figure out, wow, it looks like the foliage all around the test site is burnt up. Maybe that suggests that the missile exploded on the launch pad, or maybe it suggests that the missile was successful, because we don't see that. So we really have this kind of eye in the sky in an incredible way that did not used to be the case, for instance, in the beginning stages of the Iraq War, when the premise was that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We now have technology and access to information on the non-governmental side to be able to kind of interrogate some of the, assumptions that are put forward about what is happening in other countries. So that's something that I find really exciting. Some of this work does butt up against the kind of Eurasia space that I tend to work in. And one of the more interesting examples of that, I think, happened in August of 2019, where you guys may remember there was this explosion and a release of radioactivity in Russia's sort of Arctic Circle. And there was a lot of, uncertainty about what exactly that meant. And there wasn't a lot of particularly forthcoming information from the Russian government about what was happening. So we at CNS were able to use satellite imagery to figure out that Russia was preparing to test its nuclear-powered cruise missile at this particular test site. And we figured out that the explosion was the result of a failed recovery effort to get a nuclear reactor off of the ocean floor that resulted in this explosion and release of radioactivity, all kind of using these open source analytical tools that we now have. So that's sort of the kind of, detective work, magical, exciting, almost investigative journalistic work that we are able to do now in the NGO space, that I don't think, when I was a student, I certainly did not realize that that was part of the kind of toolkit and portfolio of work that people who worked in non-proliferation and arms control could utilize. So I wanted to make sure to call that out, because I think that that's can appeal to some of you who are really interested in kind of digging into the nitty gritty of some of these issues. You can do that in this field. So as I've been sort of harping on about over the last, however long I've been talking, there are really a lot of disciplines that are relevant to this work. And I've mentioned a couple of them in passing, but I want to be sure to kind of treat these explicitly, because I think that's one of the things that I hope you take away from this talk. A lot of my own work, as I kind of alluded to, does relate to history. So I spend a lot of time looking at archival material. It's not even all just sort of what you might imagine archival research to be, where you're kind of combing through dusty documents, and some of it might be very boring. Some of it involves doing things like reading old science fiction magazines. So I just had a co-authored article come out in a publication called International Security. And part of what we were looking at as part of this research was the sort of normative and social context surrounding the early pursuit of radiological weapons in the United States and the Soviet Union. And so to understand that context, we had to read science fiction to understand, how were people thinking about these weapons? What was the public discourse like compared to what was happening in the classified side? So, lest you think that the sort of historical research isn't necessarily interesting, I hope I can disabuse you of that, because there is a lot to do there that informs the way that we think about policy today. And I'm not sure that that always comes through when you might imagine what a person's job looks like in this field. The other things I wanted to be sure to sort of talk about in particular were the visual arts. So this might seem to you like something that doesn't have any relationship whatsoever to kind of nuclear policy issues or WMD policy issues, but that's very much not the case. There's a really fantastic organization. It's a sort of creative arts collective called Bombshell Toe. And the woman who runs that is focused on kind of using the arts and using visual storytelling as ways to help bring more audiences and more stakeholders into the conversations that are happening around the governance of weapons of mass destruction. And I know for a lot of us, like for me, I can read about something that happens in a book, but often when I see it in a movie or I see it, in a painting, I have a much better understanding of, oh my gosh, that's what the magnitude of a nuclear explosion would look like, or something like that. It's just very hard for us, in our human minds, I think, to kind of conceive of that intellectually, but seeing it really helps. And so there's a super important role in that kind of semiotic and narrative building around nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction that the visual arts play. And so I hope for those of you who are kind of interested in that, that you know that there is a absolutely essential role for you to play by bringing those skills into these conversations. And I think as a field, we're starting to recognize the importance of that more and more. So there's going to be more room for those kinds of conversations. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about is sort of related to all of this, which is the importance of journalism and media studies. So, some of the work that we do does happen in a kind of closed door environment. So, it's these personal conversations between individuals that are really how policy sometimes gets enacted. But part of our mandate, my mandate at CNS, is to help the public understand what's happening with respect to weapons of mass destruction and nuclear policy. And journalists and media experts help us tell those stories. So having journalists, if any of you are thinking about that sort of for your future, who understand the nuances around weapons of mass destruction and around policy and around the science is crucial to helping us give people more of a sort of toehold and feel like they have more agency in engaging with these issues. And I think that that's something that's really important, but we don't often talk about. So I wanted to make sure to kind of call that out, because there is this outward facing work that we need to do in our field if we want there to be more diversity in every sense of the word. And we can kind of talk more about what that looks like. So anyway, if you see something on here that grabs you, or if you have questions about where does my own area of interest fit in, I'd love to talk about those in Q&A. So the good news for all of this, I guess it's good news, although it's kind of, it speaks to the challenges that these issues kind of pose for us as a community, is that we need more people with these skills to do this kind of work. I mean, nuclear weapons issues have been challenging policymakers for decades, and they will continue, unfortunately, to do that for decades more to come. But we are facing a potential personnel crisis in our field that will make doing that work very difficult. So you can see some kind of statistics up here, but by 2023, which is really not a very long time from now, 40% of the employees at the National Nuclear Security Administration will be eligible to retire. And that administration is what oversees the United States nuclear stockpile. So they oversee the safety and security of our nuclear arsenal. However it is that you feel about nuclear weapons, we certainly want them to be safe while they're still here. And so those are really important jobs that we need people to be able to do. Of course, just because someone's eligible to retire doesn't mean that they're actually going to, but this is, I think, clear evidence that we need to start building up this cadre of next generation experts like yourselves to kind of slot into those roles. The same thing is true of 80% of the leadership at the State Department. So again, that doesn't mean that those same people are going to retire immediately, but it means that they might, and it means that we need to start bringing in some new voices to this conversation so that they can begin to build up that expertise, so that we can transfer the institutional memory from the people who have been there for a long time to this next generation. At the same time, we're also seeing numbers of people taking the Foreign Service exam in the United States fall really significantly. And I don't know if Nicole or Marissa, I'm sure you interact with students who are thinking about going into the Foreign Service. So I'd be curious to hear what you think about this. But to me, all of this means that we need to help more people think about how their skills are applicable to these issues, because if we don't, we're going to reach a moment where we actually do not have the expertise, I think, to be able to do the kinds of work that are necessary here. So I'm hoping I can kind of plant the seed for some of you who might be thinking about what you're going to do next, that this is an area not only where we need you, but where there could be, potentially some jobs for you to fill. But while we're doing this, and sort of the purpose of me speaking to you in particular, is that we also need a more diverse cadre of people to do this work in order to be effective. So I know this is not news to anybody who is on this call, because you guys have a very, sophisticated understanding of why diversity, not just gender diversity, but diversity across the board matters for outcomes. But we have recently sort of had a moment of reckoning in our field where it has become clear that we are very homogeneous in general, people who are working in the security space, but also in the nuclear and WMD policy space, and that is not good for our outcomes. So we now know from kind of private sector research that organizations that have more diverse boards, for example, do better financially. So there's a very clear way in which diversity matters to outcomes. We might not necessarily understand the precise mechanisms by which that is true, but the evidence is clear, and it's very, I think, bad for us as a workforce to ignore that. And so just to kind of give you a sample of how this is playing out in our field, particularly with respect to gender diversity, which is an area where I'm very interested, in part because of my experiences at Wellesley, I wanted to kind of showcase 3 different domains here. So one of them, which is on my left-hand side of the screen, is the negotiations of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which happened in 2017. This treaty is a treaty that actually bans nuclear weapons. It makes them illegal. And it just entered into force maybe 2 weeks ago. So it's a very, very new addition to the kind of architecture of treaties that are that form the non-proliferation and disarmament regime. And as you can see here, only 31% of the delegates who are registered for that negotiation are women. Now, something that's very unusual about this treaty, I think, is the visibility that 31% of the delegates had. So the conference itself, the negotiations were led by a woman diplomat, and women from the NGO community also played a very important role in kind of getting that treaty across the finish line. But it's still remarkable to me that only 31% of the delegations that were involved in those negotiations are women, particularly because the treaty itself actually talks about the importance of equity and inclusion in the nuclear space. So there's kind of a disconnect between what is happening in real life and what we would like to see, that I think is kind of drawn out by those statistics. The NNSA, that organization I referred to previously that oversees our nuclear stockpile, these are 2018 figures, but you can actually look them up online and see how things have changed. Only 33% of their workforce are women. And if you start to sort of drill down and distinguish between the policy-oriented jobs and the technical-oriented jobs that are part of the NNSA's remit, that gender disparity becomes even more distinct as you get into the more technical aspects of that job. So there definitely is a pretty significant difference between, the numbers of women and the numbers of men who are working in that field. And then, lest you think that this is either just sort of a government level problem or an international organization problem, it's not true. It's something that we are encountering in the think tank world as well. So in 2018, there was a pretty expansive study that was done of think tanks in Washington, D.C. that focus on international security issues. So not just nuclear issues, but security more broadly. And we saw there too that a very small percentage of the women who are working, of the researchers who are working at those think tanks are women. So all across the board, we're sort of seeing somewhere between 20 and 30% of any given domain being made up of women. And that's sort of astounding when you think that, women make up 51% of the global workforce or whatever it is. So we definitely have some work to do. This obviously just pertains to kind of gender equity and diversity, but the same is true for all types of diversity across our field. We don't have sufficient racial diversity. We don't have sufficient economic diversity. We don't have sufficient age diversity. We need younger people in here with their fresh ideas to help move the discourse forward. So I'm hoping that this, some of you may be thinking about, even if it's not a career in this field, feeling like you have something to contribute to this space, because we really need your efforts. And I want you to feel like you have something valuable to contribute, because you absolutely do. No one group has jurisdiction over these issues. And if that is something that resonates with you, or something that you feel to be true, the good news is that there are lots of different ways to kind of get involved in conversations around these issues while you're a student, after you finish further down the road, if you've had a different career like I did, and then you decide you want to go back and figure out how you can apply your own interest to this space. So one of them that I want to be sure to flag is an initiative that I lead at CNS. So this is in addition to the work that I do on Eurasia issues. I also run a program called the Young Women in Non-Proliferation Initiative. And the whole idea behind this initiative is to get college-aged women interested in and thinking about careers in this field. So if that's something that grabs you, I'm going to send Stacey Goddard and Tom Hodge and Marissa and Nicole the information about how to apply to our mentorship program, which I will be launching again in the spring of 2021. That program matches you with an expert in the field who shares your same areas of interest, and you work together over the course of an academic year to understand not just, what could I do in this field, but how do I get there? What are the steps that I need to take? How can I get an internship? How can I get a first job? All of that kind of thing, because I think that's really crucial when you're thinking about a field that feels a little bit esoteric like this one. Just understand the nuts and bolts of how you do it. Another, opportunity that I'll plug are the ones that we have at MIS, at the Middlebury Institute and at CNS. So we do have a summer undergraduate internship program. We have had wonderful Wellesley students who have come and spent the summer with us. So if you're interested in that program, I would encourage you to apply. You can always reach out to me individually and I will put you in touch with our program coordinator, but you can also find that information on our website. It's a paid internship, which is something I think is essential to increasing diversity in our field. And I hope you'll consider that. We also have the self-same MA program in non-proliferation and terrorism studies that I graduated from. I did not know anything about this field before I started. I just had this area studies expertise, and that program taught me how to kind of professionalize my interest in this area and helped me graduate as a person who was able to have a job. So if you're thinking ahead to next steps and you feel like this is something that would interest you, I'm always happy to talk to you as a program alumna or put you in touch with the people at MIS who are responsible for fielding applications. And then I just want to sort of mention the number of things that you can do as a student. So I know sometimes it can feel like, okay, so you guys at Wellesley are quite lucky because you have, courses that focus specifically on nuclear issues, but that's not always the case for groups of students that I talk to. And sometimes you have to kind of make your own way and carve out your own area of expertise. So this slide on the very far right is a podcast that some of our summer internship students started a couple of years ago. It is called, hilariously, Big Nuke Energy, which I think is a great title. And they talk about kind of gender issues. They talk about substantive nuclear policy issues, and they bring experts onto their show and interview them. They're college undergraduates. You can do this too. You can host your own event, particularly in this time of virtual events. You don't have to come up with travel costs. You don't have to come up with honoraria or anything like that. You can have your own event that focuses on whatever area of nuclear policy or WMD policy you find the most interesting. And I can tell you as a person who participates in a lot of these events that folks who are working in the field are almost always happy to engage with students. I love getting emails from students and I love carving out time to talk to them. And so if there are ways that people can help you, they certainly will. So don't be shy about reaching out. So I've been sort of going on and on for a little while now, and I think I'll stop and answer some questions and see what you guys think. But I hope that was helpful and helped to get us all on the same page. And I'm here to discuss further. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was incredibly helpful. Everyone who has questions, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask them if you want to engage directly. If you're more comfortable entering them into the chat, I'm happy to read questions out to Sarah as well.
Oh, I see Deborah. Deborah has one, it looks like.
Hi. I actually have a lot of questions, but I'm gonna
okay.
I'm done because there's some on just like career-wise non-proliferation, and then also just like conceptually non-proliferation, like just the idea of nuclear non-proliferation, I guess. So I'll just start on the career-wise of it. So the area that I'm really interested in, I do want to be an IR, international relations major, but I want to do with history, and my area concentration was hopefully going to be in Africa. So like I was wondering, like, because there are no nuclear states in Africa, I mean, like there was South Africa, but it did like joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty, so there's like legitimately no nuclear state in Africa right now. How does that contribute to the whole, like, how does that contribute to a career non-proliferation?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked about that, because I think I'm thinking of lots of different ideas for you. So first and foremost, if you're interested in history, I think actually the history of looking at South Africa is something that can really inform the conversation in our space and can inform contemporary policymaking. So the way that I have engaged with that particular topic is there was an instance in the summer of 1977 where that you may know about already from your research, where South Africa was preparing to test a nuclear weapon in the Kalahari Desert, right? And the United States and the Soviet Union actually worked together pretty closely to pressure South Africa not to do that. And so from my own standpoint, as a person who's thinking about what are some areas where the United States and Russia could, in principle, cooperate today, I think a lot about non-proliferation as one of those areas. I think about, preventing third parties from getting nuclear weapons, and that seems like a place where there's a shared common interest there. So looking back at the history to understand the decision-making mechanics, the mechanics that allowed the two countries to work together, despite being at a very difficult moment in the relationship, those are all things that are relevant today. But particularly with respect to Africa, there's as I know that because I can tell from talking to you, there's a nuclear weapons free zone that covers Africa. And that mechanism for preventing proliferation of those nuclear weapon free zones is something that I think we can apply to a lot of other countries. So for instance, I'm thinking in particular about the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which covers Latin America and the Caribbean and prohibits nuclear weapons there. That treaty was negotiated before, for instance, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so it actually informed the ways that the negotiators of the Non-Proliferation Treaty conceived of how is it that we verify the NPT? How do we verify, making sure that countries don't have nuclear weapons? How do we insert nuclear weapon free zone treaties into other mechanisms? So I think that there's a ton that you could come up with there. And I'd be happy if you ever want to kind of chat. I guess nothing is offline anymore because we're all online all the time, but if you want to email individually about that or set up a separate time to talk, we can absolutely come up with some other ideas. But that's a great topic. Yeah, I really like that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Of course.
I have more questions, but if somebody else wants.
You might have to take it away, Deborah. I don't know. You might be my sole questioner for the moment.
I'll wait just a couple seconds.
Okay.
To see if somebody else wants to.
I have a quick question. Sorry, Courtney.
Please. Yeah, go ahead, Imogen.
Sorry. I was just hoping you could talk a little bit more about your decision to go into non-governmental organizations versus doing a government route in non-proliferation.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's one that I think depends on your kind of personal preference, but I can talk about, what led me there. Some of it was happenstance. So because of the way that the relationship between the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, where I am, and MIS, the Middlebury Institute, I had already spent a lot of time working as a graduate research assistant at CNS. And so I felt comfortable there. I loved the projects I was working on. Some of the projects I started working on as a student are ones I'm still working on today. So they're these very long-term projects. And I just felt engaged by that work. I'm sure, if you've had work experience, sometimes you just feel like a place is right for you and it's hard to imagine yourself somewhere else. So some of it was just the particular organization where I am. But more broadly, I think I like the excitement that comes with being at an NGO. So, I work on a lot of different projects. No day feels the same as any other day. I don't know if that's the same in government. I'm sure there is plenty of excitement in government. And if you've, done government internships, I hope you'll sort of correct me if I'm wrong. But I feel like having all of these different things that I'm working on at one time, I find very stimulating. It's the same stimulation that I got from being in college, to be honest, where I was taking lots of different classes and then doing sort of spiral learning, thinking, how is the thing that I'm learning in, this, history of technology informing what I'm learning in Russian class or whatever it is. And I find that my brain works that way. So that's something that I really, really enjoy. I also like the freedom that comes from being at an NGO. I don't have access to classified information, but nothing that I produce is classified. So I don't have to run it by anybody. I can write what I want to write, speak in my own individual capacity, and kind of put my viewpoints out there. And I find that freeing. I really enjoy that. So those are kind of some of the things that kind of went into my thinking there, but I always feel a little bit trepidatious about, explaining that decision making because I don't have something to compare it to. Candidly, I have not worked in government. So some of those things are probably there for folks who do that as well. And had my life unfolded in a different way, I could be talking to you from sort of the other side of that perspective as well. But are you thinking about, do you have any sense for what you're kind of interested in the future and where you could envision yourself ending up?
No, I'm definitely curious. I actually grew up in Monterey, so
Oh my God.
yeah, so the Middlebury Institute, I have some connections like
Yeah.
learning about that like through high school. So it's always sort of been of interest to me, just proliferation as a whole, but I personally do have an interest in public service.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that would be great. I mean, I hope we need wonderful public servants. And so I really hope that some of you who are on this call kind of think about that in your future and don't let what I'm saying. I don't have anything to compare it to. I just have my experience as an NGO employee, but that can be wonderful too. So.
Awesome. Well, I had a similar question to Deborah. I'm personally also very interested in history or IR history, but more of a concentration on Latin America. And I don't have any knowledge currently about like nuclear treaties in that region, but I'm curious about what that could look like for sure.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you asked that because I think that is, I'm delighted to hear that so many of you are interested in history. And I do think that particularly in this, time of COVID, but in general, we're starting to see a real increase in the number of kind of digitized archival materials that we have access to. So even as a person who lives very, very far away from Washington, D.C., I'm still able to do a lot of archival research using digital archives. And if you're interested, we can always kind of correspond about what some of that looks like within my specific domain. But with respect to Latin America has a really interesting kind of history in the nuclear space because there are not any countries that are in that region that have nuclear weapons, but they have been some of the countries that have kind of led the conversation when it comes to thinking about how to prevent proliferation. So I mentioned this one treaty, the Treaty of Tlatelolco. That is a treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons in that entire region. And it was really a groundbreaking treaty that you can actually read the negotiating history of if that's something that interests you. But then that same treaty that I was mentioning previously that was negotiated in 2017 that bans nuclear weapons, the ambassador who led those negotiations is a Costa Rican ambassador. And so there is this real, I think, feeling and pride in Latin America about being a group of countries that is at the forefront of leading the conversation on non-proliferation. At the same time, though, when I think about some of the challenges that we face in increasing geographic diversity in the non-proliferation space, it does strike me, and something that I sometimes hear from diplomats from that region, that we have a lot of other issues that we're confronting right now. We're thinking not just about nuclear weapons, which we don't have, but all of these other issues, sort of development issues that we're trying to wrestle with right now. And so I think part of the job of people in positions like mine who are thinking about ways to increase stakeholder interest in non-proliferation and really get engaged in that conversation is thinking, how are these issues relevant to countries that don't possess nuclear weapons? And so we've been talking here a lot about kind of the military side of things, but there's also this entire side of the non-proliferation conversation about the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So not just generating energy for countries that are trying to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels, but how do we use nuclear material in medicine, for instance? There's a lot of medical technology that makes use of radioactive sources. How do we get countries access to those kinds of technologies without running the risk of increasing the likelihood of proliferation? And so I think there are a lot of areas where countries in the Latin American region can have played a really leading role in kind of trying to make sure that access to those peaceful uses are equitable and diversified. And so I think looking at some of the history of how they developed that interest in making sure that access was equitable is something that could be really interesting for you. And so in terms of kind of specific resources, the UN actually has a really great archive of a lot of digitized material, and you can read through the old negotiating history of various treaties. The organization that sort of oversees the implementation of the Treaty of Tlatelolco that I mentioned is called OPANAL, and I'll write that in the chat. And they may well have an archive that you could also look to if you're kind of interested in understanding how all of that came about. But rest assured that there's a very rich history there and a lot to kind of dig into if that's of interest.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And also, it seemed like you were mentioning something about how non-proliferation can relate to sustainable development.
Right. Yes.
Could you just elaborate on that just a little?
Yeah,
I'm very
for sure.
about development efforts, for sure.
Yeah. So I should have mentioned that more explicitly, and I'm really glad you reminded me. Obviously, as we're thinking about sort of the future of climate change and thinking about ways to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, one thing that people have been talking about increasingly after a period of not being very interested in this is nuclear energy. How could nuclear energy help us change up our energy mix in such a way that we're not burning so much coal, for instance, or what have you? And so there is kind of an intersection, I think, between the areas that I'm interested in looking at, which pertain more to preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, and thinking about how do we do that in such a way that we don't inhibit people from being able to access the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And I think that there's a lot more that people could do with that conversation. So that hasn't, there's one of the things that's a little bit challenging about working in this field is that things can feel very siloed. So it can feel like the people who do arms control, where they're negotiating these treaties, are just focused on doing arms control. The people who are focused on doing sustainable development are just focused on doing that. I think we need to see a real conversation about how to blend these various interests. And in the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, there are some mentions of the importance of nuclear disarmament and the importance of non-proliferation. So I think that that's starting to be a bigger part of the conversation, but there's definitely room for more nuance and more exploration there. So if that's something that interests you, again, like we can correspond offline, and I'd be happy to point you to some stuff that I think is really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Deborah, do you want to return to your, I know you have a list of questions. So
I think Cynthia was raising her hand.
Okay, please do. Hi, Cynthia.
Hi, Cynthia.
Hi, nice to meet you. Thank you for the talk. It was really very insightful. Bye-bye. I have an interest in US and China relations and beyond that to like maybe the separate branching off question, but I'm also interested in how as an NGO, how you play into the non-proliferation field at different levels, like local, national, international, and beyond.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think, for me personally, in my own work, I tend to focus on kind of the national and international level. And so sometimes when I'm engaging in the national level, it could be through briefings. So sometimes, we'll give briefings to government officials. There are different organizations, like we're a nonpartisan organization, but there are certainly organizations within the non-proliferation and arms control space that are more partisan, and they'll take a specific stand on a particular issue and advocate that on the Hill, for instance, or to lawmakers in the United States or abroad. And so if you're kind of interested in like shaping and feeding into the debates that are happening domestically around these issues, there are definitely organizations within the NGO space that really focus on specific issues and on kind of advocacy work around them. So that's one thing for sure. In my own experience, within the international space, we engage in a couple of different ways. So some of them are, with respect to US-Russia issues, hosting these dialogues or convening dialogues between either current policymakers or former policymakers or experts, and kind of making sure that that dialogue continues even at these very difficult moments in the relationship. And if you're interested in kind of US-China relations, similar things happen on the US-China side, surprisingly enough. So there are actually, we call these track 2 dialogues that happen between American and Chinese experts. But in the bigger kind of multilateral space, for instance, when I go to, there's a treaty called the Non-Proliferation Treaty that we've mentioned a couple of times here that gets reviewed every 5 years, as you may know. When I go to those review meetings, so there are these kind of lead up meetings to the big review conference, and then there's the big review conference, I'm often on a national delegation. And so we're kind of engaging with international delegates in that context as well. Sometimes they'll have side events at the United Nations that happen over the lunch break or after hours, where the NGO community is sharing different ideas and sharing out their research. And so my colleagues and I and other colleagues at think tanks will present on those panels and help to kind of shape the conversation, hopefully, that is happening on the government space. But it can feel difficult to sometimes have the impact that you might want to on some of those international conversations. And so I think going back to one of the earlier questions about, how do you make this distinction between whether you want to work in government or work at an NGO, if what you really want to be doing is making policy, then that is an argument for going into government work, because that's when you're actually able to be at the table, having an impact on what the policy looks like. Whereas my role is, it has these freedoms that go along with it, but it's a little bit different. It's hoping that we can feed into the policymaking process in that way. So I hope that's helpful. But if you're interested in US-China, there's so much to do there in the nuclear space, as you can imagine. And I'd be happy, again, to kind of send some resources if that's something that you would like. So great.
Thank you very much.
Of course, my pleasure.
Can I go next if nobody else wants to? Okay, so this is, I guess, another question that is related to more of the career-wise aspect of it. So I'm only a first year, but I've been wanting to do like IR since like high school and stuff. And I tried applying to a lot of scholarships and like internship opportunities in high school regarding international relations. And one thing that kept coming up against me was citizenship status, because I'm not a US citizen, I'm an Ethiopian citizen. And a lot of that stuff, like I couldn't apply to a lot of scholarships relating to IR because a lot of them required US citizenship. So I was wondering if I were to apply to internships and all that, I'm not even thinking ahead to career-wise. Like I'm pretty sure it's hard to get a government position without US citizenship or something like that. So like how that affects me as a non-US citizen.
Yeah. So I think, definitely, I think for most government internships, you're right on that you probably do have to be a US citizen to do most of those. But within the NGO space, particularly if it's an internship or if you're applying to, an MA program or something like that, no, I'm not aware of any citizenship requirements for those types of things, unless it's a program that is like specifically for American women or, something like that. But no, in the NGO space, the colleagues that I work with, for instance, it's an incredibly diverse group. We've got people from all different nationalities. And so that's not something that I have really seen come up at all. So I would feel, if you're interested in kind of the IR space, I would look to maybe the NGO or think tank world for internships and things like that to see what might be available there, because I think there should be a lot of opportunities there. Yeah.
Thank you. That was like one thing I was concerned about. So,
Good.
I want to add one thing on that front, because if you find over the coming years that you are interested in pursuing a postgraduate fellowship or scholarship for graduate study, anything like that, on our career education website, on the fellowship section of the website, we have a way to filter by opportunities that are available to non-US citizens.
Wow.
So it's something that you might want to take a look at in the coming years, because if you already know where your research interests lie, you may very well want to pursue a fellowship at some point.
That's a great, I didn't know that. That's a really cool resource. Yeah.
thank you. I have more questions, but I'm gonna wait if there's somebody else who has questions.
Okay, well, we'll see. But I mean, you're asking great ones, and I'm sure they're ones that a lot of people want to know the answer to as well. So let's see.
Sarah, I might ask a question that I suspect others might be interested to know the answer to. Because at one point in your presentation, you mentioned having done an internship at the UN.
Mhm.
And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about internships that you did, whether during college or after college, and how those influenced your career path.
Yes. Okay. That is a great question. So I can tell you, this is like I'm going to report some negative results and some positive results. So when I was in graduate school at the University of North Carolina, I did not do any internships. And I know that sounds absolutely crazy, but this was, several years ago, and it was not such a big part of the kind of student experience to need to do those internships in order to get a job. I rectified my error when I went back to graduate school at the Middlebury Institute. And I decided when I went to graduate school there that, I'm quitting my job to do this. I'm moving across the country. I really want to make the return on my investment good. So I am going to do whatever comes my way and whatever opportunities present themselves. And I'm going to really seek these out. And so, lo and behold, I think I'd lived here for about 2 months, and I got this internship at the UN. And I had to say to my, poor husband, who also moved with me and did not know anybody in Monterey, I'm very sorry, but I'm going to need to move back to New York City, and you're going to good luck to you here. I'll be back. So I did. I went and did this 5-month internship at the UN, my second semester of grad school, and it ended up being a tremendous experience, and the kind of thing that has continued to, I think, inform my thinking today in ways that I did not anticipate when I was even doing it. So that internship was, for those of you who are focused on kind of nuclear issues, it was the review conference of this Non-Proliferation Treaty that we've been talking about that happened in 2015. And my job was to work at the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, which is the kind of serves as like the informal secretariat for that treaty and kind of helps to make sure its negotiation goes as planned. And I got to see, what the diplomats were doing when they negotiated. I got to see how hard they work. I got to see how much they knew sort of in the diplomatic space about, what had previously been agreed to in the context of this treaty over the last 50 years, et cetera. And it was astounding. And it's it actually did set me down the path of what I'm doing now within this domain that I work in, because I am so interested in kind of international and multilateral diplomacy. So that is something I would highly recommend if you have the opportunity to do it. I was able to do it in such a way through the Middlebury Institute that I actually got some support for my living expenses and things like that in New York, even though the UN internships themselves are not typically paid. So looking into ways to get some support from your own home institution, whether it's, Wellesley or your graduate program, is something I would really recommend, because obviously it's expensive to live in New York City. But there are plenty of internships like that at all of the UN organizations: the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, the UN headquarters where I was, the UN in Geneva, the UN in Vienna. They all have internship programs, and I would highly, highly recommend it if that's the kind of thing that is available to you. And beyond that, I didn't really do that. That kind of was my big internship experience that I had at MIS, where I now work. But I did do all of these kind of practical graduate research assistantship type things when I was a student. So I worked, about 20 hours a week the whole time I was in my grad program. And it was the same type of thing we were describing previously, where I would kind of learn stuff in my classes and then immediately be able to apply that to the work that I was assisting with at CNS. So again, if you have chances to kind of do a part-time job alongside with the work that you're doing in your classes, that can be a really helpful way, if it's not overwhelming, to see how the work that you're doing is, or the things that you're learning are directly connected to the type of work that you're doing. And I certainly found that to be, for me, that I'm that type of learner. So that really helped me kind of solidify my knowledge.
Looks like we can go to you, Deborah.
Yep, Deborah, you're up.
I'm going to ask one more question because I'm just going to put a lot of questions into one question because they're kind of all the same.
Sure.
So one thing, I took Professor Goddard's world politics class, and one thing we did do was discuss nuclear non-proliferation, just nuclear proliferation in general. And one of the interesting papers we read was a paper by Sagan and Waltz, and it was discussing like, proliferation versus like just, is proliferation really bad and stuff like that? Yeah. And I also did in high school debate, one of the resolutions I did was states ought to eliminate their nuclear arsenals. And just in general, it's easier to debate negative on those sides. So I did a lot of negative arguments against not eliminating nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. So how does, like, when you see critiques on the idea of non-proliferation, like the Non-Proliferation Treaty and all these things are saying like, is non-proliferation really necessary? Especially like, I know one was like environmental implications of non-proliferation, like nuclear waste, and then there's like deterrence arguments against it, and like all these things, like how, like, I guess, how do non-proliferation organizations and treaties, etc., like justify themselves in this like market of like where there's debate whether they're necessary or not? So yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was actually just looking at my bookshelf because I think I have the Sagan and Waltz An Enduring Debate book somewhere over there. No, I mean, that's a fantastic question. And I think, obviously, there are a lot of different arguments, as you well know, if you had to prepare for debates on this, that people can take to explain why it is that non-proliferation is important. The one that I think resonates with a lot of people, even if they're sort of taking a realist approach or thinking very much about sort of what is in the US national interest, for instance, is that it actually is not in the US national interest for other countries to get nuclear weapons. So when we think about what kind of shapes the American threat perception and the types of threats that the United States has to protect against, even if if that is your major focus and it's not thinking more about sort of how do we facilitate international cooperation, I think there's a very clear argument to be made that we do not want other countries to be getting nuclear weapons. Now, the logical extension for me of that, as someone who focuses on US-Russia issues, is that we also need to figure out ways to engage not only with allies, but also with potential adversaries in making sure that we shore up the non-proliferation regime so that it works the way that it's supposed to, so that the United States and Russia, for instance, in the activities that they're engaging in are not changing the threat perceptions of other countries in such a way that they think they need to get nuclear weapons. So a lot of my work stems from kind of that obviously is the guiding premise, that we don't want other countries to develop nuclear weapons. But there are a lot of, I have to say, I don't encounter it a lot that people are sort of have not bought into the idea of non-proliferation. That's not an argument that I run into as much as I run into the argument of, well, we shouldn't be engaging in arms control because that is somehow going to limit the US's ability to exercise a flexible response to any kind of a given threat. But you're absolutely right that there are people who believe, let's just let other countries get nuclear weapons and then we will all be deterred, and that will, work to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. But that's not a philosophy that I personally subscribe to. And I think there are really compelling arguments like what Sagan was making against that I certainly referred to in my own work. So yeah, great question.
So, yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, I also have to leave because I have another meeting in like 10 minutes, I guess.
Well, so please stay in touch. Yeah, let me know if I can be of help. really, truly.
Thank you.
Of course.
Goodbye.
Bye. See
Deborah.
you. Bye, Deborah.
Thanks so much for this, Sarah. That was great.